Where we left off the other day, it was the end of 1967. The United States had escalated our involvement in Vietnam War from 1965. We've got about 500,000 guys in country. That phrase "in country" was used during the Vietnam War to mean you were like now literally boots on the ground in the nation of South Vietnam. We've escalated our war in Vietnam. We are conducting search and destroy missions as we wander through the countryside looking for Viet Cong or looking for North Vietnamese army. And remember, during the Vietnam War, we're really fighting two separate, most of the time, entities. The Viet Cong, who are the South Vietnamese communists, and then the People's Army of Vietnam, or the North Vietnamese Army. And those are the regular soldiers from North Vietnam. And so we're doing search and destroy missions from 65 to 67. And at the end of 1967, through fighting this war of attrition, through the counting of the dead bodies of the Vietnamese that we find, our military is going to report back to the President of the United States that we are getting close to the end of this war. All right? We're getting close to the end of this war, and that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. This is General William Westmoreland. This is General William Westmoreland, who's the leader of American forces in Vietnam. And by the end of 1967, he's going to be reporting to President Johnson that things are going well in Vietnam, and we could use some more men to further push the communists in South Vietnam, but we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And this is going to make its way from the military to the president to the people of the United States. So in the end of 1967, Americans are starting to hear that this war is going well and that we have nearly won it. All right? We'll come back to this story in a few minutes, but I want to talk about what's going on domestically as we are fighting in Vietnam. We begin with the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder, and please understand that Operation Rolling Thunder, this bombing campaign that we started in February of 1965, is long. Okay, it's going to start in 65, and it's going to continue all the way until 1968. All right. So this is, Operation Rolling Thunder is a protracted bombing campaign of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Once we start bombing North Vietnam, you start to see the rise of a protest movement in the United States. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about this, because one thing the IB is going to like to do, especially on the paper 2 question about 20th century wars, is have you compare different wars, how they were similar and how they were different. The fact that there was an active anti-war protest movement in the United States during the Vietnam War makes it a unique war compared to any that came before it in American history. So we're going to see, with the escalation of the war in Vietnam in 1965, we're going to see an escalation of an organized anti-war protest movement. Now, in the 1960s, there was a lot to protest, and there were a lot of people to do the protesting. And I want you just to take a time out from your notes and just sit back and remember something that I think we've already talked about this year, and if not, just hear it again right now. After World War II, we remember we had a lot of soldiers coming back home from the war, and they had some savings from money that they earned during the war, and maybe their girlfriends or their future wives back home in the United States had a lot of money socked away from the war, because maybe she was one of these Rosie the Riveter types who never really had a job before, but now she had a job. But when you're getting paid for a job, but there's not much to spend on because there's rationing of consumer products, you save a lot of money. You might take a lot of the money that you're earning during the Second World War, and instead of spending it, what do you do with it? You invest it in buying war bonds. Very good. And eventually those bonds mature and you've got some money behind you. And guys are going to come back from the war, and they're going to get married, right? And they're going to start families. And this ushers in a major demographic shift in the United States known as the baby boom. Very good. So if you were born, not any of you, but if an American was born between 1945-ish and like the end of the 1960s, you're considered part of this baby boom generation, when American families had a boost, a jump in the number of kids that they were having compared to before. Those are the baby boomers. In addition to that, you've got a lot of these guys, these soldiers coming home from the war that are going to be getting some benefits from the federal government that never existed before to soldiers coming home. Benefits coming in the form of a law passed by Congress at the end of World War II called the GI Bill. And if you recall from talking about this, the GI Bill would give cheap, federally sponsored loans to buy a home, which is nice if you're going to start a family to have a home. It's going to give loans for college. And today there's still a lot of Americans that want to go into the military right after high school to help them pay for their college, right? There's going to be loans to help start businesses. So after World War II, we're going to see guys going to college, and some girls, but guys going to college in numbers that they had never gone before, all right? We're also going to see, there are African Americans that served in the Second World War. There's Hispanic Americans that served in the Second World War. You have people that are not the traditional college type in America in the pre-war years, who are pretty much upper-class white Americans were the ones that primarily went to college before World War II. After World War II, the GI Bill knows no racial distinctions. So you're going to have a lot of new Americans, whether they be poor white Americans or maybe minority Americans, having the ability to go to college in numbers that had never happened before. All right? Now, don't get me wrong. There's far more people today that are going to colleges than in the 1940s and 50s. But in the 40s and 50s, we're going to have a dramatic boost compared to what we had before, largely due to the GI Bill. The number one predictor, every teacher knows this, the number one, and every school knows this, the number one predictor of whether a young person is going to go to college or not is whether or not their parents went to college. It's all about how education is emphasized in a household. And so now we've got some soldiers who might never have gone to college before World War II would have happened. Now they've gone. And it becomes a foregone conclusion that their children will start going to college. So in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s, not surprisingly, this is like 1963 is 18 years after 1945, the first time baby boomers were born, right? So in the mid-60s, you start to see a swelling of college students. The children of this greatest generation, the baby boomers, starting to go to universities for the first time in their lives, all right? And so colleges, new colleges and universities are going to sprout up all over the country, all right? And community colleges are going to sprout up all over the country. I believe if we look at like Michigan, Eastern Michigan University, where I went, used to be Michigan State Normal College, which is a weird phrase for a school that teaches teachers. A normal school is a school that teaches teachers. But in I believe it's the early 1960s, Eastern Michigan became Eastern Michigan University, or Michigan State Normal College became Eastern Michigan University. Ferris State University, Saginaw Valley State University, Oakland University, these all had their origins in this era of explosive university growth in the 1960s. And not only that, but the schools that were already here, Michigan State and University of Michigan, and Western Michigan, they're going to dramatically grow during this time period. So far more people are going to go to colleges and universities than ever before. And this is happening at the exact same time. There's a lot of things for young Americans to be frustrated about. The Civil Rights era, very good. The 1960s is the pinnacle of the Civil Rights movement. You've got nuclear war. The threat of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. So we get protest movement about maybe reducing nuclear arms across the world. You have a growing women's rights movement that women are advocating for an equal rights amendment, for example, that will ultimately never come, but they're still advocating for it. And then the Vietnam War story gets added onto all of these other protest movements. And it will grow to be the biggest one. Another reason that the Vietnam War protest movement or anti-Vietnam War protest movement will grow is because of the reality of the draft. The United States military needed soldiers to fight in this war. So we instituted a draft. Every young American male, when he turns 18 years old, has to register for a draft. All right? Doesn't mean you're ever going to be drafted. When I turned 18, I registered for the draft. I was never drafted. We haven't had a draft since the Vietnam era. But if you're 18, has anybody already registered? I believe you can do it online, I would have to imagine now, right? Yeah, I imagine you can do it online. I had to do a postcard, I believe, at the post office. Okay, and so if you don't do it, you won't be able to get federal aid for college. You won't eventually be able to get federal aid to buy a house. So you can't get like a federally backed mortgage. What's that? Well, yeah, because some are, you might not be 18 right at the start, right? It only becomes illegal to not have registered for the draft if there is a draft. And then you become a draft dodger. You're evading the draft. So there was a draft during the Second World War. Here's a picture of an actual draft lottery from 1969. And like now that we're all hopped up on lottery fever, like with this Powerball thing, it's the exact same way. Except in this one, you're hoping you don't win. There's 365 numbered balls, and if they're in 1969, I don't know particularly what this draft would have been for, but maybe they're drafting 19-year-olds. So if your birth year was 1950, you've got a number that's inside this, maybe you're number 1, and that's for January 1st, or maybe 365 for December 31st. And if your number gets pulled out for this particular draft, you and everybody else that was born on the same day as you in 1950 will have to report to their local draft board, where they will have to answer some questions, and they will do a physical exam, and then they're going to be told where they go next. And for most of the people that would be drafted, their next stop is going to be boot camp, basic training, and they will be trained to eventually enter into the Army. Now, there's a couple ways to avoid the draft, but most Americans that were drafted never avoided the draft. Please understand that. We spend a lot of time talking about outliers, all right? Most young American men that were drafted, guess what they did? They went and served. Most went and served, all right? There were ways to avoid service, but they're not guaranteed. You could be a conscientious objector. You could claim what's known as conscientious objector status. Something in your conscience says that you cannot fight in this war, or not, typically it's not even this war, because if you say I can't fight in this war, well, that means it's probably a political stance that you have, not something like within your conscience. If you say I can't fight within any war, like for example, if you belong to a religion that practices like absolute non-violence, what's that? Like the Quakers, very good. Like you are you wouldn't want a bunch of Quakers on your front line of your military because they're probably not going to ever fire the trigger, right? So you might be able to claim conscientious objector status. You would have to present your claim to a judge, and the judge would rule, all right? Most famously, you guys might have heard of Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was heavyweight champion of the world at the time, and he was drafted to go into the Army. And he claimed conscientious objector status, that this war was not something within his conscience that he could go fight. He famously argued that no one in Vietnam ever racially discriminated against Muhammad Ali or any African American. He didn't quite use those words, but no one ever discriminated against Muhammad Ali in Vietnam. He's got no problem with those people, so he shouldn't have to go to war with those people. Well, he also was a recent convert to the Nation of Islam that opposed America's fight in Vietnam. Time out really quick, don't write this, just hear it. The Nation of Islam is the black Muslim group in the United States. It was born in the years after World War II. If you've heard of Malcolm X, if you've heard of Malcolm X, Malcolm X was born in Lansing, Michigan as Malcolm Little. Eventually he got in some trouble, street crime, burglary type things. He was in jail. In jail, he met up with some members of the Nation of Islam, and he converted to Islam within his prison. And then he became one of their chief spokespeople and leaders of the Nation of Islam in the United States. Ultimately, it was the Nation of Islam that killed Malcolm X. It's a very interesting story, and you should look into it sometime. But that's what Muhammad Ali was a member of, and the judge said no. So Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete arguably in the world at the time, went to jail because he didn't respect his draft obligations. And guys, just registering and serving in our military, if our country drafts you, is every bit as important as paying your taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. If you get drafted and you don't serve, unless you have a viable reason to not do it, you will serve. All right? Some Americans receive deferments. Now, some of you know very well right now what a deferment is, right? Like, you can postpone this, okay? We'll push it down the road a little bit. Maybe you are finishing up college. Maybe you've got some other reason to possibly be exempted for the time being, maybe family obligations. You might be able to petition for a deferment. Some might be exempted from the draft because of other situations. For example, if you were a young man right out of college and you just got a job being a teacher. Well, a teacher might be a job that might leave you exempted from serving in the military because we need teachers at home. You know, you're not going to pluck a school's teacher away from them. Possibly during the Vietnam War, you might have other arrangements like, hey, maybe you've got some connections. Like maybe your father happens to be a big deal in the CIA, and he can get you, rather than getting drafted to go to Vietnam, you can get a position to fly airplanes for the Texas National Guard. Anyone know who I'm talking about? Yeah, George W. Bush. His dad was a big deal in the CIA, so George W. Bush got a coveted position to fly in the Texas National Guard. So while his contemporaries ended up flying planes over Vietnam, George W. Bush flew planes over the Gulf of Mexico, which was a much safer job to do, obviously. So there would be exemptions. Most of the deferments and most of the exemptions are going to go to typically white, upper middle class, and upper class Americans. All right? Because you might have the ability to go to college and pay for something like that, or to avoid it in some other way. So a lot of young people are being drafted, which is leading a lot of young people to be very concerned about being drafted. And it's going to swell these anti-war protests. But please understand this. In 1965, in 1966, and 67, most Americans supported the United States position on Vietnam. Most Americans supported our involvement in Vietnam. So despite the fact that a large anti-war protest movement existed, most Americans still supported the war effort before 1968. All right? Why? Well, some in the protest movement just didn't like the war, thought we shouldn't be involved in this war. And a lot of Americans could wrap their head around that one. It's on the other side of the world. North Vietnam never attacked us. This is not a United Nations thing like the Korean War was. The Korean War was a United Nations action. This one isn't. There's a lot of viable reasons to not support the war. But then some others that didn't support the war effort were a part of a new and growing counterculture movement in the United States. When I say counterculture, going against the traditional culture. The young people that grew their hair out long, maybe danced kind of differently from their parents' generation, maybe ingested some things that might have made their minds work in different ways at different times. And the average American looked at this generation, this hippie culture, and said, well, I don't want to associate with that. And so you wouldn't go to an anti-war protest if a lot of that type of person was there. You wouldn't want to be associated with it. And then there were some within the anti-war protest guys that were outright leftists, that were like supportive of the communist movement, right? Or supportive of communism in general. That thought that went further than saying the United States shouldn't be in this war. They said the United States is like wrong in the Cold War. The United States is on the wrong side. And again, that's something that mainstream America couldn't really wrap their head around, right? So while the anti-war protests would be large, they would never become a majority of the population, you know, heading out to these marches. Now, I started talking about the colleges. The point of all this, yes, Darsha? Like, remember we talked about the Orthodox Cold War beliefs and then the revisionist beliefs? Most Americans were of the Orthodoxy. They were raised and they were taught and they read everything that said the Cold War was about the United States defending the free world against communism. By the 1960s, you have a revisionist movement. saying, well, the United States is actually wrong, or the United States is on the wrong side of this story. And many young Americans are starting to support the ideas of the communist world, right? Well, mainstream America couldn't connect with that. I don't like that. So they wouldn't go to these marches. Now, I started off talking about the baby boom and the growth of colleges around the country, because where do most of these protests, where are they mostly born out of? Colleges and universities. Because in addition to having a bunch of young people who are idealistic, young people that are in college, what do they not have to do every day from 9 to 5? They don't have to go to work. So they can protest and they can rally and they can get passionate about things that people that have to take care of family responsibilities or jobs can't always put their time towards. So I want you to understand that an anti-war protest movement grows, but it will ultimately, especially in the early years of the war, not have a major impact on American policy. Okay? We do also start to see, by late 1967, some in Washington, D.C. questioning American involvement in Vietnam. We were told more troops would bring a win to this war. And by 1967, by late 67, we've got 500,000 guys in South Vietnam. And some are questioning whether we're really winning at this point. Robert McNamara himself, the Secretary of Defense of Lyndon Johnson, the guy that was most responsible for encouraging Johnson to escalate in Vietnam, he even begins to question whether this war can be won in South Vietnam. Despite these questions, Johnson continues to escalate, sending more troops into South Vietnam, while sending the message to Americans back home that the light is at the end of the tunnel. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are close to winning. And this is in the end of 1967. In January of 1968, everything changes. Guys, we've talked about turning points in wars this year, right? We talked about the Battle of Stalingrad, maybe in the Second World War, as a turning point in the Second World War. Or maybe Operation Overlord in the D-Day invasions as a turning point in the Second World War. We talked about a naval battle in the Pacific called the Battle of Midway as a turning point in the Pacific, where things might not have been going very well beforehand, and then they start to turn the other way. In the Vietnam War, January of 1968, January 30th in particular of 1968, 30th. It's a holiday in Vietnam known as Tet. Tet is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam. It's the biggest holiday in Vietnam. One of my Vietnamese students in my last block said that it is like pretty much the holiday in Vietnam. It's the one celebrated by everyone. And the Tet holiday in Vietnam prior to 1968 has been a day that everybody kind of stopped. And people went to their families, and like the ARVN troops might have left the bases to go stay with their families and celebrate with them. And it was a day where the war just kind of slowed down, only to resume after Tet. In the end of January of 1968, the Army of Vietnam, North Vietnam, okay, the People's Liberation Army of Vietnam, that's North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong in the south, they will launch a series of coordinated attacks on every major military installation and city in South Vietnam. 86,000 communist troops. The United States and the South Vietnamese had no belief that the communists in Vietnam could ever orchestrate something like this. It falls on the Tet holiday, and it is called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive. The goals of the Tet Offensive for the communists are to launch this massive coordinated attack against all of South Vietnam, to convince the Americans that they are not and cannot win this war, and to try to get us to go to the negotiating table with terms favorable to the North Vietnamese. The plan begins with diverting American troops into the countryside, luring American troops and South Vietnamese troops into the countryside away from their bases by having diversionary attacks in the northwest of the country. And then, as I said, on January 30th, 1968, starting in the middle of the night, 84,000 communist troops will start to strike at the most valuable and important cities and military installations throughout South Vietnam, including the capital of South Vietnam, a city called Saigon, including the American embassy in Saigon, which will be captured by Viet Cong. This is bad news. The Americans and the South Vietnamese, the ARVN troops, are caught completely off guard by this, completely surprised, had no idea that the Vietnamese communists were able to coordinate an attack like this. But militarily speaking, the Tet Offensive was a failure. Now remember, we have to go kind of backwards thinking on this Tet Offensive. It's the communists, North Vietnamese, and Viet Cong's offensive. They failed. Of all the land and all the ground that they took during the initial hours and days of the Tet Offensive, American and South Vietnamese forces would regain it all. And when all was said and done after this offensive, communist forces lost 30,000 of their 84,000 force. It's about 40% of all of the guys that they started this fight with are going to be falling in the Tet Offensive, while the Americans and the South Vietnamese lost about 3,500 guys. So 10-1, the Americans outkilled, and then South Vietnamese outkilled the communists. And the communists don't have that many guys to spare. The ARVN troop, yes sir?
Was the United States aware of the amount of troops that the Vietnamese lost?
Eventually, yeah. I mean, this is not something that's known like right away, but they're counting and stuff. Yeah. So all of the land that the communists gained is eventually regained by the Americans and the South Vietnamese. But while the Tet Offensive is not successful militarily for the communists, it is absolutely successful in changing American perception of the war. The Tet Offensive is going to be televised in the United States. There's reporters in Vietnam who are reporting back when this happens. If you recall, William Westmoreland had just reported to the American president, who reported to the American people that we are almost at the end of this war, that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But how could the light be at the end of the tunnel when the Vietnamese communists are launching the biggest attack that they will launch in the entire course of the war? It doesn't seem to make sense. And many Americans will begin to doubt what their government is telling them. General Westmoreland, our leader in Vietnam, is going to use Tet to try to convince the president to give him even more troops. We've defeated them after their largest engagement. And now we just need more troops to continue pushing, and we will win this war. Johnson will reject this call to escalate further. Because now we're into January, into February of 1968. What is right around the corner? An American presidential election coming up. 1 second. Yes? Westmoreland will request more. Yes.
When did he say that he wasn't going to run for the election?
That's not yet. It's going to come, I believe, in the springtime. He's not there yet. Yeah, Johnson will eventually not accept his party's nomination, but he's not there yet. The American media begins to look disfavorably on the war. And we've already talked about how powerful images coming out of Vietnam can be. This is a photo that was published around the world of the execution of a Viet Cong suspect on an open street in Saigon. And this is a South Vietnamese police officer who's going to pull out his revolver and kill this man on this street. And this is going to be spread around the world. And this kind of picture is going to have a pretty big impact in the United States, making us question, making some Americans start to question what our involvement and what our role in Vietnam really is. Remember, he's the enemy. He's Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong launched this attack on the Tet Offensive, killed many people. And the Viet Cong had been tormenting and torturing the people of South Vietnam in the villages. And this guy is captured. You can see his hands are bound behind his back, right? He's been captured. But he's not thrown in jail. He's not put on any kind of trial, right? He's not put in a prisoner of war camp and fed and clothed and taken care of as he is supposed to be in a wartime situation. He's murdered on a street, right? By a government official. And it begins to have Americans questioning who we are supporting and are we really supporting the right cause here in Vietnam. Popular opinion in Vietnam is going to start shifting. If we go back to the beginning of the war in 1964 and 1965, Americans were polled and asked, should we be sending troops into Vietnam? Was it right to send troops into Vietnam? Early in the war, more Americans said yes than no. Or the question is, was it a mistake? More Americans said no, it wasn't a mistake, than yes. And eventually, we get to 1968, in January 1968, and we begin to see those lines start to cross each other. After Tet, more Americans will say, yes, it absolutely was a mistake. Now, this isn't a complete question, because another question would be, okay, we're already there. Should we bring these guys home? That's a whole other question, right? But in terms of was it a mistake at all, you can see how our perceptions change. I would like you guys to think about a war that you have lived through, our involvement in Iraq since 2003, when you guys were wee little ones, right? When we started in Iraq, more Americans were supportive of getting involved in Iraq to oust Saddam Hussein from power. But as time went on, that support started to dwindle. And now even many policy people today that supported us getting involved in Iraq are starting to look at that as a possible mistake, all right, or a misstep. Anyhow, one last name to mention. This is Walter Cronkite. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of Walter Cronkite or heard the name, even if you don't know who he is. Today it's quite different. You guys get your news from all kinds of sources. At least, where's your favorite place to get news from? Google News? Okay, news on Google. Where? Al Jazeera. Where else? Yes. ESPN. We're better than that. French news. Okay. Anywhere else? Vice. People like to watch that. NPR. Government-sponsored news source. CNN, Fox News, NBC, MSNBC, CBS. Right? Reddit. Excellent. Reddit. Just various Twitter feeds of people that happen to be on the ground where news is happening, tweeting what's going on. We get our news from all kinds of sources. In the 1960s, Americans got their news from local newspapers, and every city had multiple local newspapers, daily newspapers. They got their news from television and radio. And the big players on TV and radio were ABC, NBC, and CBS. And CBS was the big daddy of them all. And Walter Cronkite was the big daddy of the big daddy. Walter Cronkite was the voice for most Americans getting their news through the 1950s into the 60s and 70s. Walter Cronkite. After the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite is going to go to South Vietnam. And he's going to begin reporting from the field. And Walter Cronkite will report back to the United States his opinion of what's going on in Vietnam. Please do not write this, just listen to this. To say we are closer to victory today is to believe in the face of evidence the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest that we're on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we're mired in a stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. On the off chance that the military and political analysts are right, In the next few months, we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted American news media professional. It is clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. America's most important voice in the media is now saying what? Yeah, it's time to get out of this. It's time to get out of this. And not surprisingly, American public opinion will start to lean towards getting out of this. All right? And if we go back to this chart that we looked at the other day, where we talked about the escalation of our numbers in Vietnam, and we can see with the Gulf of Tonkin incident following 1965, that's when we started Operation Rolling Thunder, and that's when we put our first Marines on the ground. Escalation in 1968, and in 1969 we've begun to draw our troops down. The Tet Offensive and the aftermath of Tet is a dramatic turning point, and you must know that January 1968 time in the Vietnam War. Everybody good? Good.